horror stories. We can blame Twilight on them if we want to. So this is The Judge's House by Bram Stoker. When the time for his examination came near, Malcolmson made up his mind to go somewhere to read by himself. He feared the attractions of the seaside, and also he feared complete rural isolation, for of old he knew its charms. And so he determined to find some unpretentious little town where there would be nothing to distract him. He packed a portmanteau with some clothes and all the books he required, and then took a ticket for the first name on the local timetable which he did not know. When, at the end of 3 hours' journey, he alighted at Benchurch, he felt satisfied that he had so far obliterated his tracks as to be sure of having a peaceful opportunity of pursuing his studies. He went straight to the one inn which the sleepy little place contained, put up for the night. Malcolmson looked around the day after his arrival to try to find quarters more isolated than even so quiet an inn as the good traveller afforded. There was only one place which took his fancy, and it certainly satisfied his wildest ideas regarding quiet. In fact, quiet was not the proper word for it. Desolation was the only term conveying any suitable idea of its location. It was an old, rambling, heavy-built house surrounded by high brick wall, massively built. Indeed, on examination, it looked more like a fortified house than an ordinary dwelling. But all these things fleed out of him. Here, he thought, is the very spot I've been looking for. If I can only get the opportunity of using it, I shall be happy. From the post office, he got the name of the agent. Mr. Carnberg was a genial old gentleman, and frankly confessed his delight at anyone being willing to live in the house. Have you the truth? Said he. I should be too happy to have the house rent-free for a term of years. Only to accustom the people here to inhabit it. It has been so long empty, some kind of absurd prejudice has grown up about it. Malcolmson paid his 3 months' rent, got a receipt and the name of an old woman who would probably undertake to do for him, and came away with the keys in his pocket. He then went to the landlady of the inn and asked her advice as to such stores and provisions as he would be likely to require. She threw up her hands in amazement when he told her where he was going to settle himself. "Not the judge's house?" she said, pale as she spoke. He asked her to tell him about the place, why so called, what there was against it. She told him that it was so called locally because many years before it was the abode of a judge who was held in great terror on account of his harsh sentences and his hostility to prisoners. As to what there was against the house, she could not tell. She had often asked, but no one could inform. There was the general feeling that there was something. "If you were my boy, you wouldn't sleep there at night. Not if I had to go there myself and pull the big alarm bell that's on the roof." The good creature, so manifestly in earnest, Malcolmson was touched. "But, my dear Mrs. Witham, indeed, you need not be concerned about me. A man who is reading the mathematical triumphs is too much to think of to be disturbed by any of these mysterious somethings." Mrs. Witham kindly undertook to see after his commissions, and he went himself to look for Mrs. Dempster, the old woman who had recommended to him. When he returned to the judge's house with her, he found Mrs. Witham herself waiting with several men carrying parcels, and an upholsterer's man with a bed in a cart. For she said though tables and chairs might be all very well, a bed that hadn't been aired for mayhap 50 years was not proper for young bones to lie on. Malcolmson decided to take up his abode in the great dining room, which was big enough to serve all his requirements. Before going, Mrs. Witham expressed all sorts of kind wishes, and at the door she turned and said, "I tell you the truth, I would die myself if I were to be so shut in with all kinds of these things." The image she called up was too much for her nerves, and she fled. Mrs. Dempster sniffed in a superior manner as the landlady disappeared, and remarked that for her own part she wasn't afraid of all the bogies in the kingdom.
I'll tell you what it is, sir,
she said.
Bogies is all kinds and sorts of things except bogies. Rats and mice, and beetles, and creaky doors, and loose slates, and broken planes, and stiff drawer handles that stay out when you pull them, and then fall down in the middle of the night. Oh, look at the wainscot of the room. It's old, hundreds of years old. Do you think there's no rats and beetles in there? Rats is bogies, and I tell you, bogies is rats, and you don't get to think anything else.
She set to work with her cleaner, and by nightfall, when Malcolmson returned from his walk, he found the room swept and tidied, a fire burning in the old hearth, the lamp lit, the table spread for supper. "This is comfort indeed," he said. When he had finished his supper, he got out his books. He set himself down for a spell of real hard work. He went on without pause till about 11 o'clock. And then it was that he began to notice, for the first time, what a noise the rats were making. Surely, he thought, I cannot have been at it all this time. All this time I was reading. I mean, had they been, I surely would have noticed it. Presently, the noise increased. He satisfied himself that it was really new. It was evident that at first the rats had been frightened at the presence of a stranger and the light of a fire and lamp. But as the time went on, they had grown bolder and were now disporting themselves as was their wont. Oh, how busy they were! Up and down, behind the old wainscot, over the ceiling and under the floor they raced and gnawed and scratched. Malcolmson smiled to himself as he recalled to mind the saying of Mrs. Dempster, "Bogies is rats, and rats is bogies." He allowed himself the luxury of a good look around the room. He took his lamp in one hand and went all around, wondering at some quaint and beautiful little house that had been so long ago. There were some old pictures on the walls, but it was so coated thick with dust and dirt, he could not distinguish any detail. Here and there, as he went around, he saw some crack or some hole blocked for a moment by the face of a rat, with its bright eyes glittering in the light, but in an instant it was gone, and a squeaking scamper followed. The thing that struck him most, however, was the rope of the great alarm bell on the roof, which hung down in the corner of the room on the right-hand side of the fireplace. He pulled up close to the hearth the great high-backed carved oak chair, and then he went back to his work. For a while, the rats disturbed him somewhat with their perpetual scampering, but he got accustomed to the noise, as does one to the ticking of a clock or the roar of moving water. And suddenly he looked up. The noise of the rats had ceased. Indeed, it seemed to him that it must have ceased but lately, and that it was the sudden cessation that had disturbed him. And there, on the great high-backed carved oak chair by the right side of the fireplace, sat an enormous rat, steadily glaring at him with baleful eyes. He made a motion to hunt it away, but it did not stir. And he made a motion of throwing something, it did not move still. So then, it showed its great white teeth angrily at him, its cruel eyes shone in the lamplight with an added vindictiveness. Malcolmson felt amazed and, seizing the poker from the hearth, ran at it to kill it. Before, however, he could strike it, the rat, with a squeak that sounded like a concentration of hate, jumped upon the floor and, running up the rope with the alarm bell, disappeared in the darkness beyond the rain of the green shaded lamp. Instantly, strange to say, the noisy scampering of the rats in the wainscot began again. By this time, Malcolmson's mind was quite off the problem, so he went back to bed. He slept so sound that he was not awoke by Mrs. Dempster coming to make him up his room. He was a little tired still after his night's hard work, but a strong cup of tea soon freshened him up, and taking his book, he went out for his morning walk. On his return, he looked in to see Mrs. Witham. When she saw him coming, she came out to meet him and asked him in searchingly, and shook her head and said, "Tell me, sir, how did you pass the night? Well, I hope."
"Oh, it was all right,"
he answered, smiling. "There's some things didn't worry me as yet. Only rats. And they had a circus, I tell you, all over the place. There was one wicked-looking old devil that sat up on my own chair by the fire. Wouldn't go, so I took a poker to him. And he ran up the rope with the alarm bell and got to somewhere up on the wall or ceiling. I couldn't see where, it was so dark.
Mercy on us,
Said Mrs. Witham.
an old devil. The old devil, perhaps. There, you needn't laugh, sir.
Forgive me, said Malcolm presently. I don't think we would, but the idea was too much for me, that the old devil himself was on the chair last night. And at the thought he laughed again, and then he would hold it to dinner. This evening, the scampering of the rats began earlier. Indeed, it had been going on before his arrival, and only ceased whilst his presence by its freshness disturbed him. How they scampered up and down and under and over, how they squeaked and scratched and gnawed, and how they, getting bolder by degrees, came to the mouths of their holes, and to the chinks and cracks in the crannies, and the wainscoting, till their eyes shone like tiny firelights, and they rose and fell. Sometimes the boldest of them made sallies out onto the floor, or along the mouldings of the wainscoting. Now and again, as they disturbed him, Malcolmson made a sound to frighten them, smiting the table with his hand and giving a fierce hush, hush, so that they fled straight away to their holes. And so the early part of the night wore on, and despite the noise, Malcolmson got more and more immense in his work. All at once he stopped, being overcome by a sudden sense of silence. There was not the faintest sound, or gnaw, or scratch, or squeak. The silence was as in the grave. Instinctively, he looked at the chair, standing closely by the fireside. There, on the great old high-backed carved oak chair, beside the fireplace, sat the enormous rat, steadily glaring at him with baleful eyes. Instinctively, he took a book and flung it at it. Well, the book was badly aimed, and the rat did not even stir, so again, the poker performance of the previous night was repeated, and again, the rat, being closely pursued, fled up the rope to the alarm bell. Strangely, too, the departure of the rat was instantly followed by the renewal of the noise made by the general rat community. Malcolmson could not see in what part of the room the rat disappeared, for the green shade of his lamp left the upper part of the room in darkness, and the fire burned low. He began to think that he would like to know where the rat disappeared to, for he had certain ideas for the morrow, and not entirely disconnected with a rat trap. Accordingly, he lit another lamp, placed it so that it would shine well into the right-hand corner of the fireplace. And then he got all the books that he had with him, placed them on the table, handy, ready to throw at the vermin. Finally, he lifted the rope of the alarm bell and placed it on the end of the table, fixing the extreme end under the lamp. As he handled it, he could not help noticing how pliable the rope was, especially for so strong a rope and one not in use. But Agamemnon thought to himself. He began its work again, and though, as before, somewhat disturbed at first by the noise of the rats, soon lost himself in his propositions and problems. This time it might not have been the sudden silence only which took his attention. There was a slight movement on the rope as well, and the lamp moved. As he looked, he saw the great rat drop from the rope onto the oak armchair and sit there glaring at him. He raised a book in his right hand, taking careful aim, and flung it at the rat. The latter, with a quick movement, sprang aside and dodged the missile. And then he took another book, and then a third, and flung them one after the other at the rat, but each time unsuccessfully. At last, one flew, and the book struck the rat, a resounding blow. He gave a terrified squeak, and turning on its pursuer, a look of terrible malevolence, it ran up the chair back and made a great jump to the rope with the alarm bell, and ran up it like lightning. Malcolmson kept his eyes on the rat, and saw, by the light of the second lamp, it leaped to a moulding of the wainscot and disappeared through a hole in one of the great pictures which hung on the wall, obscured, invisible through its coating of dirt and dust. I shall look up my friend's habitation in the morning, said the student, as he went over to collect his books. Third picture from the fireplace, I shall not forget. He slept heavily, but uneasily, and when Mrs. Dempster woke him, his first request rather surprised the servant. Mrs. Dempster, when I'm out today, wish you would get the steps and dust or wash those pictures, especially the third from the fireplace. I want to see what they are. When Malcolm arrived home, he found that it was a little after his usual time, and Mrs. Dempster had gone away. He was glad to see that the place was bright and tidy, and a cheerful fire had been set. It was a well-trimmed lamp. For a few minutes after his entrance, the noise of the rats ceased, but so soon as they became accustomed to his presence, they began again. His mind ran back to the strange fact that they only ceased to manifest themselves when that other, the great rat, baleful eyes, came upon the scene. After his dinner and his cigarette, he sat steadily down to work, determined not to let anything disturb him. For an hour or so he worked all right, and then his thoughts began to wander from his books. By this time there was a wind, and it had become a gale. And the gale had become a storm. The old house seemed to shake to its foundations. Even the great alarm bell on the roof must have felt the force of the wind, for the rope rose and fell slightly. On the oak floor, falling, hollow, hard sound. Looking up instinctively, Malcolmson saw the great rat coming slowly down towards him, glaring at him. So he dropped the rope and he started back with a muttered curse. And the rat, turning, ran back up the rope again and disappeared. And at the same instant, Malcolmson began conscious of the noise of the rats, which had ceased for a while, and then began again. And all of this set him thinking. It occurred to him that he had not investigated the lair of the rat, or looked at the pictures. So he lit the other lamp, the one without a shade, and holding it up, went and stood opposite the third picture from the fireplace on the right-hand side, where he had seen the rat disappear on the previous night. At first glance, he started back so suddenly that he almost dropped the lamp. A deadly pallor overspread his face. His knees shook, and heavy drops of sweat came to his forehead. The picture was of a judge, dressed in his robes of scarlet and ermine. His face was strong and merciless, evil, crafty, and vindictive. The eyes were of peculiar brilliance, and with a terribly malignant expression. As he looked at them, Malcolmson grew cold, for he saw there in those eyes the very counterpart of the eyes of the great rat. Yet the judge was seated in a great high-backed carved oak chair on the right-hand side of the stone fireplace, where in the corner a rope hung down from the ceiling, its end coiled on the floor. With a feeling of something like horror, Malcolmson recognized the scene as the room where he stood, and gazed around him in awe, as though he expected to find some strong presence behind him. Fire had fallen low, and had ceased to flame, though it threw out a red glow. Malcolmson listened attentively, and presently he heard a thin, squeaking noise, very faint. It came from the corner of the room where the rope hung down. He thought it was the creaking of the rope on the floor, as the swaying of the bell raised and lowered it, but looking up, however, he saw in the dim light a great rat clinging to the rope and gnawing it. The rope was already almost nearly gnawed through. As he looked, the job was completed, and the severed end of the rope fell clattering on the oaken floor. Malcolmson felt for a moment another pang of terror, as he thought that now the possibility of calling the outer world was cut off. But the intense anger took its place, and seizing the book he was reading, he hurled it at the rat. The blow was well aimed, but before the missile could reach it, the rat dropped off and struck the floor with a soft thud. Malcolmson instantly rushed over towards it, and it darted away and disappeared into the darkness of the shadows of the room. He took off the green shade of the lamp so as to ensure a wider, spreading light. As he did so, the gloom of the upper part of the room was relieved, and in the new flood of light, pictures on the wall again stood out boldly. And from where he stood, Malcolmson saw opposite him again the third picture on the wall from the right of the fireplace. And to great fear came over him. In the center of the picture was a great irregular patch of brown canvas, as fresh as when it was stretched on the frame. The background was just as before, with chair, chimney corner, and rope. But the figure of the judge had disappeared. Malcolmson, almost in a chill of horror, turned slowly around. began to shake. He trembled like a man with palsy. His strength seemed to have left him. He was incapable of action or movement, hardly even thought he could only see and hear. And there, on the great high-backed carved oak chair, sat the judge in his robes of scarlet ermine, with his baleful eyes glaring vindictively, with a smile of triumph on his resolute, cold face. Pulse and felt as if the blood was running from his heart, as one does in moments of prolonged silence and suspense. He stood for a space of time that seemed to him endless, still as a statue, with wide-open, horror-struck eyes, breathless. As the clock struck, so the smile of triumph on the judge's face intensified, and at last, at the stroke of midnight, the judge placed a black cap on his head. Slowly and deliberately, the judge rose from his chair, picked up the piece of rope of the alarm bell which lay on the floor, drew it through his hands as if he enjoyed its touch, and then deliberately began to knot one end of it, fashioning it into a noose. This he tightened, pulling hard, until he was satisfied, and then making a running noose of it, which he held in his hand, and then he began to move. Malcolmson saw the judge approach, and raised the noose, throw it towards him as if to entangle him, and with great effort, Malcolmson made a quick movement to one side and saw the rope fall beside him. Again, the judge raised the noose and tried to ensnare, ever keeping his baleful eyes fixed on him. And each time, by mighty effort, the student just managed to evade it. At last, in despair, Malcolmson cast a quick glance around him at the many rat holes in the chinks and crannies of the wainscots. He saw the rat's eyes. He looked around and saw that the rope of the great alarm bell was laden with rats. Every inch of it was covered with them, and more were pouring through the small circular hole in the ceiling whence it emerged, so that with their weight, the bell was beginning to sway, and hark, it had swayed till the clapper had touched the bell. The sound was a tiny one, but the bell was only beginning to sway, and it would increase. But the sound, when the judge looked up, the scowl of diabolical anger overspread his face. His eyes fairly glowed like hot coals, and he stamped his foot with a sound that seemed to make the house shake. A dreadful peal of thunder broke overhead as he raised the rope again, while the rats kept running up and down the rope as though working against time. This time, instead of throwing it, the judge drew close to his victor and held open the noose as he approached. As he came closer, there seemed something paralyzing in his very presence. And Malcolmson stood rigid as a corpse. He felt the judge's icy fingers touch his throat as he adjusted the rope. The noose tightened. Then the judge, taking the rigid form of the student in his arms, carried him over, placed him standing in the oak chair, and stepping up beside him, put his hand up and caught the end of the swaying rope of the alarm bell. As he raised his hand, the rats fled squeaking and disappeared through the hole in the ceiling. Taking the end of the noose which was around Malcolmson's neck, he tied it to the hanging bell rope. Then descending, he pulled away the chair. When the alarm bell of the judge's house began to sound, a crowd soon assembled. Lights and torches of various kinds appeared, and soon the silent crowd was hurrying to the spot. They knocked loudly at the door, but there was no reply. Then they burst through the door, poured into the great dining room. And there, at the end of the rope, the great alarm bell hung the body of the student. And on the face of the judge, in the third picture to the right of the fireplace, was a malignant smile.